all the godless. You know what that word means again? It means that when anyone does not revere God or fear God or give him the glory or majesty or honor that he's due, that is godlessness. That ever happened to you? You know, when I was pondering this, I would have never put the word ungodly on me. I say, yeah, I'm a sinner, but I'm not ungodly. But when I understand this definition, I have to say, you know what? Probably most of the time I'm ungodly. Because most of the time I'm not giving God all the honor he deserves. I'm not giving him all the respect he deserves. I'm not giving him all the glory. I'm just being me, doing my thing. And God says, I'm revealing my wrath because this is what I see. Nobody's paying attention. And when I'm not thinking about God, I'm not giving honor. Do you know what happens then? I do wicked things. And that's why God says, I'm beginning to reveal my wrath against all of this. And their actions of people who suppress the truth. And he says, and you know what? People don't even want to think about me. You know why? Because they're too busy doing their wicked things. I mean, when you're doing something wrong, you're not thinking about God. Right? You're not. You're thinking about whatever it is that you're into. And God says, so you don't even think about me because you're caught up in all the junk you're doing. And he says, verse 19, now he says, and it's being revealed against everyone who do this stuff, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. Now wait a minute. That says that if you caught that, it says that every single person now, and he's going to say this, is without excuse. He says, because you can't say, well, I just, how can I think about God all the time? I mean, how can I do that? It's just, I just forget about God. It's not like God standing right there and I'm just kind of going this way when he's right behind me. I'm not even paying attention to him or having any conversation with him. It's like, I'm ignoring him. But you know what? God says that's what you're doing. He says, because I have made myself and the knowledge of me plain to every single person. How could God make it plain? Well, let me show you. There's a couple things here I'm going to turn you. If you're in Romans, if you go backwards, Acts is right in front of you there. So go back to Acts chapter 14. Okay? So we went through this a while back when we were going through Acts. But when Paul was preaching to different towns where there were unbelievers, right? They didn't know anything about Jesus. They didn't know anything about the good news. They didn't know anything else. So they're kind of like without excuse, or they're kind of like ignorant, right? You can't really blame them. But listen to what is said here. Acts chapter 14, beginning in verse 15. Let's see here. Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things, which were like idols and stuff like that, to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. Verse 16. In the past, he let all nations go their way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season. He provides you with plenty of food, and he fills your hearts with joy. Did you catch that? God said, listen, it rains. Crops grow. You eat. You have happiness. You have joy. You live on an earth that I made. You see a sea that I made. You see the heavens that I made. He says, you are without excuse. I've been good to you forever, ever since creation. And you have not given me any credit. You say, well, that's not fair, isn't it? Now, wait a minute. I mean, you can say, we're going to get into this here a little bit. We're a little more sophisticated now in the 21st century, right? You say, well, back then, there's no such thing as primitive man. There's just back in history, okay? We didn't start out as Neanderthals and stuff like that. That's a bunch of baloney. Really, it's God made Adam and Eve, and from them came all the rest of the human race. And God was there the day that he made them. And they were made by God. But we could say, well, how could they know about God? Well, you know what? Just go outside and look around. Use your brain for just a second. Go, wow, all these hills and these trees, the trees and the grass and the bugs and the birds and the wildlife and the flowers and the clouds and the sun and the rain and the stars and the heavens. Where did all that come from? God says, I've made it evident to you. He says, just the fact that you are breathing ought to let you know that there is me. In fact, God says you are without excuse. Acts chapter 14, turn to Acts chapter 17. Again, Paul is preaching in another town, to some other non-believers, and he was in the city of Athens, right? And they're all these smart guys, right? They're doing all these philosophy things, and all they do is talk about new things and new religions, and they kind of examine it, and that's their big thing. And he says he was walking around the city, and he noticed all these idols, these like statues to all these gods. Just God here, God there. And he found one that says to an unknown God, to all these smart people. Listen to what he says, Acts chapter 17, beginning in verse 22. Paul stood up in a meeting at the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. Verse 24. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from anyone else. For in him we live and move and have our being. God says, look, I made all this stuff. I gave you breath. I gave you life. He said, and I did all this so that you would seek me, find me. But you know what? They're not. They're ignoring him. They're not paying any attention to God. They're not paying any attention to really the world around them. Now think about this. If you have eyes and you can see, don't you think God has eyes and he could see? If you have ears and you can hear, don't you think God has ears and he can hear? If you're able to create things and think things up in your head, don't you think God can create things and think things up in his head? You see, just the fact that who we are, and you breathe, you keep breathing, and you don't even think about it, but you keep breathing and you keep living. And God says, I've given this to you so that you'll use your head and think about, well, how does this happen? And realize there is a God. and look around and see all the marvelous creation and realize there's got to be someone bigger than me. And they've created all these idols. I mean, they had statue after statue after statue, and they had one that says, well, to an unknown God. Says, man, you guys are missing it. But you see, inside of everybody's heart, God has placed the fact that there is a God. And we will fill that with something. We'll either fill it with a real God or we'll put a substitute God in there. That's just the way we are as humans. God made us that way. In fact, I'll show you this. So go back to Romans. Verse 20. 1:20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. If you sit in this room today, you are without excuse. You cannot say there is no God. You're without excuse. You now are accountable. You've always been accountable to God. Just because he's made everything. Just because he's taken care of. Just because he's provided food for you. Just because he's done everything. He says, you're accountable to God. And he says, you wonder why the wrath of God is being revealed? He says, because no one's paying attention to me. No one's giving me honor. We'll see this in a minute. No one's giving me honor. No one's giving me glory. You say, well, how are you supposed to know that God's really around? I mean, what's this? We can see his eternal power and his divine nature been clearly seen. Well, I haven't seen, maybe if I saw a miracle, right? If I was with Israelites and I watched God part the Red Sea, the wall, the water, and I walk through this thing, then you say, well, that's okay. I believe God. I believe there's a God now because I saw it. Or you watch someone be risen from the dead. You go, oh, I believe that's God. Or maybe Jesus heals someone. And you go, there's got to be a God because of all the miracles and all the things in the past that have happened. But you say, well, I never saw any of that. Oh, so let's take us today. We're in the 21st century. We're smart people, right? We're smart. In fact, we've studied all sorts of things. We've learned lots of things. Let me read a few things that we've learned, okay? Let's see if I can get this right here now. So, and take this information that I'm going to read to you, because it's not common, but we'll understand it, and then say there's no God. With giant telescopes, such as the 200-inch diameter instrument at Mount Palomar in California, astronomers can observe objects 4 billion light years away, a distance of more than 25 septillion miles, whatever that is. At any given time, there are an average of 1,800 storms in operation in the world. The energy needed to generate those storms amounts to an incredible figure. 1,300,000,000,000 horsepower. By comparison, a large earth-moving machine has 420 horsepower and requires 100 gallons of fuel a day to operate. Just one of those storms, producing a rain of 4 inches over an area of 10,000 square miles, would require energy equivalent to burning 640 million tons of coal to evaporate enough water for such a rain, and to cool those vapors and collect them in clouds, it would take another 800 million horsepower of refrigeration working day and night for 100 days. Now, God says, I have revealed myself in my mighty power. We're just now beginning to figure out what that means, power. Our agricultural studies have determined that the average farmer in Minnesota gets 407,510 gallons of rainwater per acre per year, free of charge, of course. The state of Missouri has some 70,000 square miles and averages 38 inches of rain a year. That water is equal to a lake 250 miles long, 60 miles wide, and 22 feet deep. Just rain. Just God's rain. The U.S. Natural Museum has determined that there are at least 10 million species of insects, including some 2,500 varieties of ants. There are about 5 billion birds in the United States, among which some species are able to fly 500 miles nonstop across the Gulf of Mexico. Mallard ducks can fly 60 miles an hour, eagles 100 miles an hour, and falcons can dive at speeds of 180 miles an hour. The Earth is 25,000 miles in circumference, weighs 6 septillion, 588 sextillion tons, whatever that is, and hangs unsupported in space. It spins at 1,000 miles per hour with absolute precision, careens through space around the sun at a speed of 1,000 miles per minute in an orbit 580 million miles long. God has displayed his mighty power. The head of a comet may be from 10,000 to 1,000,000 miles long and have 100 million miles long tail and travel at speeds of 350 miles per second. If the sun's radiated energy could be converted to horsepower, it would be equivalent of 500 million billion horsepower. The sun. One sun. God says, my mighty power has been displayed. There's no excuse. And we're getting smarter, and we're figuring all this out. But does that turn us to God? Each second, the sun consumes 400 million tons of matter. To travel at the speed of light across the Milky Way, the galaxy which our solar system is located, it would take 125 years at the speed of light. The human heart, about the size of an owner's fist, an adult heart weighs less than half a pound, yet can do enough work in 12 hours to lift 65 tons 1 inch off the ground. A water molecule is composed of only 3 atoms. But if all the molecules in one drop of water were the size of a grain of sand, they could make a road 1 foot thick and a half-mile wide that would stretch from Los Angeles to New York. Amazingly, the atom itself is largely space. Its actual matter taking up only 1 trillionth of its volume. Except to a mind willfully closed to the obvious, it is inconceivable that such power, intricacy, and harmony could have been developed by any means but that of a master designer who rules the universe. It would be infinitely more reasonable to think that the separate pieces of a watch could be shaken in a bag and eventually become a dependable timepiece. Can you imagine it? Take your watch apart, all the pieces up, put it in a bag, and just keep shaking it until it all comes together and works. It'll never happen, right? Never, ever happen. And yet we have all this universe, this beauty. And so God says, you are without excuse. I don't care who you are. You're without excuse not to acknowledge me as God. Let's go on. Back to Romans. Chapter 1, verse 23. So everyone, God says, has no excuse. It's been plain to everyone that there really is a God. Verse 21 says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God or gave thanks to him. And that's where we are. I mean, you could put that in your seat, Or you can put it in anybody else's seat. But you know what? God says, listen, my knowledge of me is common. But people, even though they know it, they ignore it. They don't want to think about me. It says they don't honor me. They don't give me thanks for anything. I mean, we think of things like, my car works so good. I'm so glad I got my car. You know, it's been working great. And I just get in, turn the key, put gas in it, and I drive. And I love my car. My daughter just got a new car. And she was showing me it yesterday. She goes, oh, Dad, you should see it. I like this car. I love this car. And she's telling me all the features about it, right? And she loves her car. And it's a great car. And we get in our cars and we go and we think, oh, man. You know, I'm sure glad I got my car, but we never thank God. We don't say, God, thank you for my car. Thank you that it starts. Thank you that the wheels turn. Thank you that the engine's still working. I mean, it is a gift from God. Everything we have is a gift from God. Everything. And yet we ignore him. We don't give him thanks for anything. All the food in our refrigerator, we put it on the table. Yeah, well, I got that because I worked hard and went to the grocery store. Yeah, but God gave you the ability to make the money and gave you the ability to go to the grocery store, gave you the ability to find the food, gave you the ability to cook it, and is giving you the ability to eat it. But here's what we do. Verse 21. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. You know what happens when a person does not acknowledge God? This is true. Their brain goes wonky. It does. It begins to go and not function. I mean, you need to understand this. Your brain, if you put God in the right place, God says your brain is working right. You will come to right conclusions. You will be able to understand things correctly. He says, but when you take me out of the picture, he says, your brain begins to fog up. How do you think we ever got evolution? Oh, smart people thought about that. Smart people came up with that. Really? They took God out of it, so because we have to replace God, we put something else in. So someone came up, says, well, I don't believe in God. Well, then how did you get here? Well, evolution. That's how I got here. It's evolution. I mean, if you think about it, really think about it, that's the stupidest idea ever. I mean, you honestly have to be a fanatic to believe in evolution. Oh, we came from, this and that and matter and this, and then it turned into amino acids, and then it turned into this, then it turned into some slime creature, and then it climbed out of the water one day, and then it became this, and then it became a man. And well, did a man and a woman come out at the same time? Did they all transfer? I mean, it's ridiculous. Why would they come up? Why would you think of something like that? Because the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They have to come up with an answer. And look what it says. It says right here. It says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him nor God or gave him thanks, but their thinking became futile, and their hearts were darkened. In John, the book of John 3:16, we all know that verse, right? For God so loved the world, he gave his one and only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. But right after it, it says this, verse 19. Well, I'll keep going. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. Verse 19, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light, because their deeds are evil, right? So remember, ungodly, godlessness, because they don't acknowledge God, they don't honor God, so they do wicked things, so they suppress the knowledge of God, And so now it says here, they won't go to the light because if they like the wickedness in their deeds. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light so that it may be plainly seen what they have done has been done in the sight of God. Back in Romans here it says, their thinking becomes futile and their hearts are darkened. Why? Because they knew God, but they refused to give him thanks. Now, okay, let this sink in, okay? If you begin to let your thinking about God slip, okay? In other words, you don't really acknowledge him that much. You don't really give him thanks that much. You just kind of go about your life. If you do that, your thinking will begin to slip. And your heart will begin to darken. It's guaranteed. The only way you can have really clear thinking and the only way you can have your heart not in darkness but in light is that you and I have to honor God and acknowledge him in everything all the time. Because if you don't, it gets worse. Verse 22. Although they claim to be wise, they became fools. You know, we're wise people. We're college professors. You know, we know the answers. Let me tell you what it is. You know, it's all about self-actualization. It's all about self-esteem. Really what the world needs now is we need to have a little more psychological training because then we'll know how to deal with all these things and blah, 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 blah. We're wise. We've written books about it. But you know what? Bottom line is you're a fool. Because you've ignored what God's made it very plain. It's very simple. I mean, God just lays it out and we just ignore it. And we come up with some dumb thing. Why? Because we refused to acknowledge there's God. We refused to honor him. We refused to give him glory. And so God says, okay, here's what happens. Your brain starts to malfunction. Your heart starts to darken. And he says, and you become fools. Now remember, because inside of everybody's heart, we know there's a God. We know there's a God, but we don't want to acknowledge him. So if we take God out, the God of heaven, you will put something back in there. So look what people have done. Verse 23. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, verse 23, and exchanged the glory of God, the immortal God, for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds, and animals, and reptiles. You know what they did? I said, well, we got to worship something. So let's make a statue. Let's make a statue. So they make a statue. And they say, that's God right there. I made him, but now I'm going to worship him. It's so funny. It's so stupid. But people get there. All over the world they get there. They've made idols. You remember the children of Israel? Moses went up on the mountain to get the 10 Commandments. Right? The first commandment says, you shall, what is it? Make no graven image in front of me. Worship the Lord. I am one. And the next one is to make no graven image. While he's on the mountain, God just took him out of the Red Sea, took him out of Egypt, split the sea, beat up Pharaoh, killed them all, got him into there. While he's up on the mountain, you know what's going on down at the bottom of the hill? They're saying, gosh, Moses has been gone a long time. Listen, we need a God. I don't know what happened to that guy, but Aaron, we need a God. Would you make us a God? Aaron says, well, okay, well, bring me some gold. So he brings some gold, and he fashions, get this, they just got out of all those plagues and things that happened in Egypt, and crossing the Red Sea. The same people, just months ago, they said, Aaron fashions, and he makes a golden calf. You should be happy about that, Mark. See, you got a bunch of gods on your place. I better not see you bow down to any of those guys. But he makes a golden calf, and he says, here's your God. And they all said, yay, we got a God. And they begin to worship this God. Where did they get there? Because when you take God out, God says your heart becomes foolish, you become stupid, you become darkened, and they came up with a calf, a golden calf. You say, well, gosh, I'd never do that. Well, you know what else they did? I mean, they also, people, here's a guy, in Isaiah, it talks about a guy who says he's a woodworker, okay, and he goes and he gets a piece of wood, and he's carving out his piece of wood, and he kind of cuts it in half. Maybe it's a log or something he's working on. So he chops up the one half, and he builds a fire, and he's cooking himself a meal, and going, man, fire feels so good. And the other half, he whittles and carves out an idol, and he sits it over here. He says, oh man. So he's warming himself up, and he turns around, and he bows down to the other half of the log, which he carved up, and says, oh my God. And Isaiah says, are you so dumb that you're going to bow down to a block of wood? People do that stuff. Why? Because they refuse. But you say, oh, well, I would never do that. I'd never do that. No. What would you do? What do we do? Well, we say, well, Sunday morning, gosh, I got a baseball game to go to. Sunday morning, football's on. Sunday morning, it's like, I'm just too tired. I'm gonna just lay in bed. And we begin to substitute anything, everything for God. We have it's like, well, I don't have an idol, but I know I need to do something. Some people do go to church. Some people try to do good works, and they say, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be please God by what I do. And so I begin to do these things and try to live my life right, and it becomes a pile of cards, because you'll never be good enough, ever. And your idol becomes your good works. Money, people put money in there. People put sports in there. People put fun in there. People put anything like that. But you see, we substitute the real God for something else. And then we wonder, why am I so empty? Why isn't everything working for me? Why do I feel so crummy? Why do I feel so like, it's just not right? It's because you have left the true God out. And God says, this is why my wrath is coming down. Now, honestly, people, every one of us are guilty. God's going to bring wrath. Remember, there's all kinds of wrath. There's like eternal wrath, that's hell. There's consequential wrath, like, if I do this, if I steal something, I'm going to go to jail, right? There's, consequences. There's the wrath of God that just begins to cause all sorts of chaos and things like that. That's wrath of God too. And we'll see it spelled out as we go down here farther. But we are. I mean, the whole earth is crumbling. It's falling apart. Eventually it will be. Why? Because the wrath of God, the curse is upon us. But here's the deal. We deserve it. We deserve it. We brought it on our own selves. Not God's fault. It's our fault. That's why when you hear the good news about Jesus, that he's willing to forgive, and he's willing to take that penalty away, it is good news. But there's more bad news, which we will get to next week, and the week after that, because there's a lot of bad news. All right? But you have to know that. It's all truth, okay? You'll never appreciate what you have until you know what you deserve. Let me pray. Lord, I just pray for us that your word would just speak truth in our hearts. And I pray, Lord, that we will be careful to give you honor, to give you glory, to acknowledge you in everything, all the time, so that we will not be godless and we will not move into wickedness. Thank you for your kindness that you sent your Son to save us. I pray that every single person here will take advantage of that. It's a willful act, Lord, and I pray that we will willfully choose to acknowledge you and your Son. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, go with the Lord, and he will go with you.